The Arizona Territory bred its share of legendary gunslingers in the turbulent years following the Civil War. Men like Rattlesnake Jake Thompson, Deadeye Dan McGraw, and the notorious Miller brothers. But perhaps none left a more fascinating legacy than Sarah "Lightning" Hawkins, a woman whose very name would later become whispered around campfires with equal parts awe and disbelief. Some called her the fastest draw in the West. Others claimed she was just a myth, a story told to give hope to settlers in troubled times. But as three members of the infamous Carson gang were about to discover on a dusty morning in Willow Creek, sometimes the deadliest thunder comes from the clearest sky. Join me today as we delve into the story of the woman they called Lightning, whose hands could draw faster than a man could blink, and how a simple market day in Willow Creek became the stuff of Western legend. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories of the Old West, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special lined up for you. Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, spring of 1875. The town was like many others sprouting up across the frontier. A dusty main street lined with weathered buildings where hope and desperation danced together in the shadow of the Bradshaw Mountains. Market day always brought a certain bustle to the normally quiet town, with wagons and stalls lining the street, the air filled with the mingled scents of fresh produce, baked goods, and trail dust. Sarah Hawkins moved through the market with practiced ease, her dark blue dress unremarkable among the other shoppers, her sun bonnet casting a shadow that kept most from noticing her striking features. Those who did catch a glimpse of her face might notice the sharp intelligence in her green eyes, or the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence that some mistook for pride. What they never noticed was the custom-made holster hidden beneath her skirts, or the meticulously maintained Colt Lightning she'd named Thunder. Sheriff Thomas Wade, a veteran lawman who'd seen his share of trouble, watched the market from the shade of his office porch. He was one of the few who knew Sarah's secret, had seen what those delicate hands could do with a six-gun. "There's two kinds of peace in this territory," he'd later write in his journal, "the kind won by law and the kind won by legend." Sarah Hawkins gave us both, though most folks never knew it. Dr. Mary Bennett was perhaps Sarah's closest friend. In town, one of the few who knew the full story of how a Boston finishing school girl had become the fastest draw in the territory. She'd seen the scars, both physical and emotional, that Sarah carried from the day Outlaws had murdered her family on the road to California. The day a proper young lady had discovered an uncanny talent with a revolver and a burning need for justice. The market was particularly busy that spring morning. Eleanor Turner's fresh-baked pies were drawing their usual crowd, and Rebecca Mitchell's dry goods store had just received a shipment of the latest fashions from back east. Sarah had just finished selecting vegetables from the Wilson Farms stand when she first noticed the strangers. Three men, trail-dusty and hard-eyed, moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of wolves among sheep. Their gun belts rode low, tied down in the way of men who made their living by the speed of their draw. Sarah recognized them immediately. Jake Carson and his cousins, Matt and Luke. The Carson gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, their latest robbery leaving 3 bank guards dead in Prescott. The Outlaws hadn't come to Willow Creek by chance. Word had spread about the town's prosperity, about the mine payroll due to arrive that afternoon. They figured a quiet farm town would be easy pickings. What they didn't know was that they'd just walked into the hunting ground of a legend they didn't believe in. As Sarah watched them case the bank from behind her sunbonnet, her right hand instinctively brushed against her hidden holster. Thunder was about to break the morning calm, and the Carson gang was about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. Jake Carson moved through the market like a shark testing waters, his cold eyes taking in every detail of Willow Creek's layout. The town's prosperity was evident in the quality of goods displayed at the stalls, fresh produce, fine cloths, and imported luxuries that spoke of regular money flowing through the community. His cousins spread out behind him, Matt drifting toward the bank, while Luke lingered near the general store, maintaining the appearance of casual browsers. Sarah Hawkins kept her movements unhurried as she shifted her basket to her left arm, freeing her right hand. 8 years of practice had taught her the value of patience, of watching and waiting. The war between the states had spawned countless men like the Carsons, men who'd learned to kill and couldn't stop when the fighting ended. She'd tracked enough of them to recognize the signs, the way they constantly checked sightlines, how their hands never strayed far from their weapons. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Martha Wilson, the farmer's wife, whose vegetables Sarah had just purchased. The older woman's friendly smile masked a sharp intelligence that had helped her survive 30 years on the frontier, though some clouds seemed to be rolling in. Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward the Carsons. "Yes," Sarah replied softly, her refined Eastern accent carefully maintained despite her years in the territory. "I believe we might see some thunder before noon." The weight of her colt pressed reassuringly against her leg as she moved deeper into the market crowd. Sheriff Wade had also noticed the newcomers. From his position on the office porch, he could see Matt Carson's practiced casualness as he studied the bank's entrance. The lawman's hand unconsciously brushed his own gun as he recalled the wanted posters. 12 robberies in the past 6 months, 7 dead men, and a reputation for unnecessary cruelty. His deputy, young Frank Wilson, emerged from the jail with worried eyes. "Should we do something, Sheriff?" Frank's hand twitched near his holster, eager to prove himself. At 22, he had more courage than experience, a dangerous combination in the territories. "Not yet," Wade replied, keeping his voice low. "We don't want to spook them into doing something desperate. Too many innocent people in the crowd." What he didn't say was that he was waiting to see what Sarah would do. He'd witnessed her work before, had seen how she could end a fight before most men could clear leather. Dr. Bennett, watching from her office window above the market, saw the subtle dance unfolding in the street below. She remembered the night, 3 years ago, when Sarah had first arrived in town, bleeding from a bullet wound but still standing. The doctor had treated her injuries while Sarah explained her mission, hunting down the men who'd murdered her family. What had surprised Mary Bennett wasn't the story itself, but the calm, almost scientific way Sarah approached her quest for justice. "It's not about vengeance anymore," Sarah had explained while the doctor stitched her arm. "It's about making sure other families don't suffer the same fate." The young woman had then demonstrated her draw, moving so fast the doctor's eyes couldn't follow the motion. It was like watching lightning strike. There was the moment before, the moment after, and nothing visible in between. Now, as Jake Carson passed within feet of Sarah, neither acknowledged the other's existence, but there was a tension in the air, like the charged atmosphere before a storm. Luke Carson, the youngest of the cousins, paused at Eleanor Turner's pie stand, his rough trail manners making the widow uncomfortable as he sampled her wares without paying. "Might want to show the lady some respect," Sarah suggested quietly, her voice carrying just far enough. Luke's head snapped up, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he caught himself. Something in the well-dressed woman's tone, a hint of steel beneath the refinement, made him hesitate. "No offense meant, ma'am," he muttered, tossing a coin onto Eleanor's table before backing away. His eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment, trying to place what felt wrong about her presence, but the sunbonnet and proper dress presented only what she wanted him to see. The morning was growing warmer, the market crowd thickening as more townspeople arrived. Soon the mine payroll would be delivered and the Carsons would make their move. Sarah watched Luke return to his cousins, saw them huddle in conversation near the saloon. The time for waiting was almost over. Thunder was coming to Willow Creek, and only a select few knew that it would arrive wearing a blue dress and carrying a market basket. Before we dive back into our story, if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Now let's return to that fateful market day in Willow Creek, where tension was building, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Matt Carson had finished his circuit of the bank, his experienced eyes noting every detail. The single guard visible through the window, the heavy oak door that would need to be dealt with, the side alley that offered a perfect escape route. He made his way back to his cousins, moving with the calculated casualness of a predator, trying not to spook its prey. 2 hours till the payroll arrives, he muttered to Jake, pretending to examine goods at a nearby stall. Guard changes happen. On the hour, between shifts would be our best chance. His fingers drummed unconsciously on his gun belt, a habit he'd developed during the war that surfaced whenever action approached. Sarah, now positioned near Rebecca Mitchell's dry goods store, could read their intentions in their body language. 8 years of hunting men like these had taught her their patterns, their tells. The way Matt's right boot pointed toward the bank's side door, how Jake's eyes kept returning to the street that led to the stables. They were planning their escape route as carefully as their entrance. "Miss Hawkins," Rebecca called out, her voice carefully casual as she stepped onto her store's porch. "Would you mind helping me with something inside? I've just received some fabrics I think would suit you perfectly." It was their prearranged signal, developed over months of friendship. Rebecca's store offered a clear view of both the bank and the main street, making it an ideal vantage point. Inside the store, Sarah moved to the window, using the display of calico prints as cover while she observed the Carsons. Rebecca closed the door behind them, her normally cheerful face tight with concern. "Frank Wilson rode by earlier," she whispered. "Said the payroll wagon's running ahead of schedule. Could be here within the hour." Sarah nodded, calculating angles and possibilities. The store's location would put her behind the Carsons when they made their move, a tactical advantage she'd used before. "Keep anyone else from coming in," she instructed softly. "When it starts, get behind the counter and stay low." Out in the street, Luke Carson was growing increasingly agitated. Unlike his cousins, he was new to their life of crime, still carrying the nervous energy of a man not fully committed to his path. His eyes kept darting to the town's exits, to the occasional glint of a rifle barrel from the windows above, signs that more experienced outlaws would have recognized as warnings. "Something ain't right about this place," he muttered to Jake. "That woman in the blue dress. Something about the way she looked at me." Jake silenced him with a sharp glance, but the words had hit their mark. He too had felt something off about the well-dressed lady with the sunbonnet, though he couldn't place why. Sheriff Wade, still watching from his office, saw Deputy Wilson returning at a gallop. The young lawman's face was flushed with excitement as he dismounted. "Payroll wagons just past Miller's Creek," he reported breathlessly. 20 minutes out at most." The news sent a ripple through the market as merchants who knew what was coming began quietly closing their stalls. Dr. Bennett had moved to her second-floor window with her medical bag already packed. She'd seen enough of Sarah's work to know that while the young woman was lightning fast, bullets didn't always go where intended. There would be need of her services before the day was done. The Carsons, noticing the subtle shift in the market's atmosphere, began moving into their planned positions. Jake headed toward the bank's front entrance, while Matt disappeared down the side alley. Luke, still fighting his instincts, took up his position near the stables. None of them noticed how their movements were mirrored by the lady in the blue dress, how she seemed to flow through the crowd like water, always maintaining perfect positioning. Thunder rumbled in the distance, drawing eyes to the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. But the real storm was already here, dressed in blue calico and carrying a market basket. waiting for the perfect moment to show three overconfident outlaws why some legends are spoken of in whispers around campfires. The distant rumble of wagon wheels announced the payroll's approach before the cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Jake Carson's hand twitched almost imperceptibly near his holster, a movement so subtle most would have missed it. But Sarah Hawkins wasn't most people. From her position inside Rebecca's store, she noted how his breathing had changed, becoming more measured, more controlled. It was the breathing of a man preparing for violence. "Might want to step away from that window, Miss Mitchell," Sarah suggested softly, though her own eyes never left the street. "Things are about to get interesting." Rebecca nodded, moving behind. A heavy oak counter. She'd seen enough trouble in her years on the frontier to know when to take cover. Outside, the market's atmosphere had shifted. Regular customers, sensing the tension, began to drift away from the bank. Only Eleanor Turner remained at her pie stand, her weathered hands steady as she continued serving, though her eyes held a knowing glint. She'd survived the Apache Wars. A few outlaws wouldn't drive her from her spot. "You really should move along, Mrs. Turner," Deputy Wilson suggested, trying to clear the area without raising alarm. The widow just smiled, continuing to serve her pies. What Frank didn't know was that Eleanor's rolling pin was hollow, concealing a well-maintained derringer. Like many frontier women, she believed in being prepared. Matt Carson emerged from the alley, giving his cousin Jake an almost imperceptible nod. Their timing would need to be perfect. Hit fast, grab the payroll, and be gone before the town could organize any resistance. Luke, positioned near the stables, had already mounted his horse, ready to provide their diversion. Dr. Bennett watched the scene unfolding below, her trained eye noting details others might miss. The way Sarah's posture had changed, becoming more fluid, more balanced, the subtle shift of her skirts that suggested she'd widened her stance. Mary had seen gunfighters prepare for action before, but none moved, quite like Sarah Hawkins. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Sheriff Wade's voice came from behind her. He'd made his way quietly up to her office, choosing the doctor's vantage point over his own. "How she can look so perfectly proper while getting ready to unleash hell." "I've seen mountain lions with less predatory grace," Mary agreed softly. "Did you warn the bank guard?" Wade shook his head, his eyes never leaving the street below. "Best he reacts naturally. Don't want to tip our hand too early." The payroll wagon appeared at the end of the street, its two guards alert but unprepared for what awaited them. Jake Carson began moving toward the bank's entrance, his spurs singing against the wooden sidewalk. To anyone watching, he looked like just another customer going about his business. Inside Rebecca's store, Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her, the strange clarity that always preceded action. Her left hand still held the market basket, maintaining her carefully crafted image of frontier gentility, but her right hand had subtly shifted, ready to reach through the specially designed slit in her skirt. "I count 8 people still in the line of fire," she murmured, more to herself than Rebecca. "Mrs. Turner won't move. She never does. The Cooper children by the fruit stand need to be cleared." She was already calculating trajectories, planning her shots with the precision that had made her legend. Luke Carson was the first to break, his nerves finally getting the better of him. He spurred his horse forward several seconds too early, sending it charging through the market square before Jake could reach his position. Stalls toppled, produce scattered, and screams filled the air as people dove for cover. "Damn fool, kid," Sarah whispered, watching Jake and Matt exchange glances. Their carefully laid plans were unraveling, and she knew from experience that desperate men made desperate choices. The Carson gang would have to improvise now, and improvisation meant increased danger for everyone in range. Through her window, Sarah saw Jake's expression shift from controlled focus to something harder, more reckless. He was changing plans, On the fly, and that meant innocence could be caught in the crossfire. The time for waiting was over. Sarah Hawkins straightened up, her right hand dropping to her side as she prepared to show the Carson gang why some legends aren't just campfire tales. The storm that had been threatening all morning was about to break, but the lightning would strike first from a lady's concealed holster rather than from the gathering clouds above. If you're just joining us in this story of the Old West's most unexpected legend, you might want to catch up on our previous segments. Now, let's return to that fateful moment in Willow Creek's market square, where chaos was about to meet its match. Luke Carson's premature charge through the market had scattered the remaining shoppers like quail before a fox. Produce carts overturned, their contents painting the dusty street in splashes of color. The Cooper children, finally heeding Sarah's silent prayers, darted to safety behind their mother's skirts. Only Eleanor Turner remained unmoved at her pie. Stand, her rolling pin now gripped like a weapon. Jake Carson, his original plan shattered by his cousin's impetuousness, made a split-second decision that would prove fatal. Instead of proceeding to the bank as planned, he drew his revolver and fired a shot into the air. "Nobody move!" His voice boomed across the square. "This is a robbery!" Matt Carson, cursing his younger cousin's panic, emerged from the alley with his own gun drawn. He took up position covering the street while Jake turned toward the approaching payroll wagon. The guards were already reaching for their weapons, but Jake's reputation with a gun wasn't unearned. "Drop them, or die where you sit," he called out, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who'd killed before and would do so again without hesitation. The guards, weighing their options, slowly lowered their hands from their holsters. Sarah Hawkins watched this tableau unfold through Rebecca Mitchell's store window, her mind calculating distances and angles with mathematical precision. She'd learned long ago that gunfights were won or lost in the planning, in the split-second decisions made before the first shot. "Rebecca," she whispered, never taking her eyes from the scene outside, "when it starts, stay down and keep your head covered. This won't be like last time in Prescott." The shopkeeper nodded, remembering the incident 6 months ago when Sarah had stopped a similar robbery attempt with a single, impossibly fast draw. Deputy Wilson, young and full of misplaced courage, chose that moment to make his move. "Drop your weapons!" he shouted from near the sheriff's office, his voice cracking slightly. "You're surrounded." It was a bluff, and a poor one at that. Jake Carson's response was as swift as it was brutal. His gun swung toward the deputy with practiced ease. "Kid," he drawled, "you just made a serious mistake." His finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow for Sarah Hawkins. She saw Jake's intention in the subtle shift of his stance, read death in the cold calculation of his eyes. The lady in the blue dress moved with liquid grace, her right hand dropping through the concealed slit in her skirt to the custom holster beneath. "I wouldn't." Her voice cut through the tension like a steel blade, carrying all the authority of an approaching storm. Jake's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of a well-dressed woman stepping out of the store's shadows. "Ma'am," Matt Carson called out, his own gun still covering the street, "best you stay quiet and still if you want to live through this." There was almost genuine regret in his voice. He'd never been one for killing women. Sarah's sunbonnet had fallen back, revealing features that somehow managed to be both delicate and deadly. "Gentlemen," she said softly, her refined Eastern accent carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I'm going to give you one chance to surrender. More than you gave those guards in Prescott." A flash of uncertainty crossed Jake's face as he processed her words. How did she know about Prescott? But uncertainty quickly hardened into anger. Who did this woman think she was? "Lady," he snarled, "you're about to learn some hard lessons about frontier life." His gun began to swing toward her with the speed that had made him feared throughout the territory. But Sarah Hawkins had already begun to move. her right hand rising from beneath her skirts with the liquid grace of a striking rattler. Thunder was about to live up to its name, and the Carson gang was about to learn why some legends are written in gun smoke and whispered about in saloons from Texas to the Dakotas. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Some claimed it was impossible, that no one could draw that fast. Others swore on their mothers' graves that they'd seen it with their own eyes. But all agreed on one thing. On that spring morning in Willow Creek, Jake Carson learned too late why they called her Lightning. Jake's gun had barely begun its arc toward Sarah when Thunder cleared its holster. The Colt Lightning seemed to materialize, in her hand, as if conjured by magic. Her first shot caught Jake's gun arm, just as his finger tightened on the trigger, sending his bullet harmlessly into the dirt. The second shot, following so quickly it seemed part of the first, struck his shoulder with surgical precision, spinning him like a top. Matt Carson was faster than his cousin, already firing as he dove for cover behind an overturned wagon. But Sarah moved like smoke in a windstorm, her skirts swirling as she stepped sideways, letting his bullet pass through the space she'd occupied a heartbeat before. Thunder spoke again, and Matt's hat leaped from his head, a neat hole drilled through its crown. That was a warning. Sarah's voice carried clearly, still maintaining its cultured Eastern accent despite the violence. The next one goes lower. Her gun remained rock-steady, tracking Matt's position behind the wagon. Luke Carson, still mounted but now frozen in shock, stared at the scene unfolding before him. His cousin Jake, the fastest gun he'd ever seen, lay groaning in the dust. Matt, who'd once outshot 3 men in a Santa Fe saloon, was pinned down by a woman in a blue dress. "Lady," Luke's voice cracked as he raised his hands away from his guns, "just who in blazes are you?" "The ghost of your future," she replied softly, "if you don't surrender right now." Thunder's barrel never wavered from Matt's position as she addressed the youngest Carson. "Your choice, boy. Live smart or die stupid." Sheriff Wade, watching from his office doorway, saw Matt Carson's shoulders tense and knew what was coming. "Don't do it, Carson," he shouted. "But some men would rather die than surrender to a woman." Matt exploded from behind the wagon, gun blazing. He managed to squeeze off 2 shots, but Sarah seemed to dance between them, her movements fluid as water over stones. Thunder roared once more, and Matt Carson's gun went spinning from his suddenly nerveless fingers, along with 2 of his trigger fingers. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. Jake Carson lay bleeding but alive, his famous drawing, arm now useless. Matt knelt in the dust, cradling his mangled hand and staring at the woman who'd outdrawn them both. Luke remained on his horse, hands raised, face pale with the realization of just how close to death he'd come. Dr. Bennett was already moving toward the wounded men, her medical bag in hand. "You're getting better," she commented to Sarah as she passed. "Last time you had to kill one of them." "Practice makes perfect," Sarah replied, her gun still covering the scene with unwavering precision. Deputy Wilson and several townsmen had emerged to secure the prisoners, their earlier fear replaced by a kind of awe. Eleanor Turner calmly continued serving her pies, though now she added commentary to her sales. "Best show I've seen since the war," she told a stunned customer, "and I ain't even charging extra for the entertainment." Rebecca Mitchell, emerging from her store, began straightening the overturned market stalls. "I don't suppose you'd help me clean up before you go?" she asked Sarah with a small smile, "since you partly caused this mess." "A lady always helps with the tidying," Sarah responded, finally holstering Thunder once the Carsons were securely bound. She smoothed her skirts and adjusted her sunbonnet as if nothing more exciting than a social tea had occurred. But word was already spreading through Willow Creek and beyond. Telegraph operators would work overtime that day, sending the story across the territory. The legend of Lightning Hawkins, the fastest drawer in the West, had just added another chapter. And in saloons and camps across the frontier, men would learn to think twice before assuming a lady in a blue dress was just another easy target. The storm clouds that had been threatening all morning finally broke, sending a gentle rain to wash the blood and dust from Willow Creek streets. But the real thunder had already done its work, leaving 3 infamous outlaws to ponder their mistakes and adding another tale to the growing legend of the woman they called Lightning. Before we dive back into our tale, if you're enjoying this story of the West's most remarkable gunslinger, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story about the Apache Kid's last stand is one you won't want to miss. Now let's return to that rain-washed afternoon in Willow Creek, where 3 outlaws had just learned a lesson they'd never forget. Dr. Mary Bennett worked with practiced efficiency, treating Jake Carson's shoulder while Deputy Wilson kept him covered. "The lady shot clean," she commented, probing the wound. "Missed the major blood vessels, but severed the muscles that control fine finger movement. You won't be drawing a gun quickly again, Mr. Carson." Jake's face, pale from blood loss, and shock twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Who is she?" he demanded, wincing as the doctor cleaned the wound. "Really? Because ain't no proper lady shoots like that." "That's where you're wrong," Sheriff Wade said, entering the doctor's office with his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. "Miss Hawkins is a proper lady in every sense. She just happens to be the fastest draw I've ever seen." He paused, letting that sink in. "And I served with John Wesley Hardin during the war." Outside, the gentle rain had cleared the market square of onlookers, though Rebecca Mitchell's store remained busy. Word of Sarah's feat had spread through town like wildfire, and suddenly every lady in Willow Creek needed to make a purchase that would let them catch a glimpse of the woman who'd outdrawn the Carson gang. Sarah, however, seemed completely unruffled by the attention. She helped Rebecca reorganize her displaced merchandise, her movements as precise and ladylike as if she were arranging flowers at a Boston tea party. Only the subtle bulge of thunder beneath her skirts hinted at her other nature. "You'll have to teach me that trick with the skirt sometime," Rebecca said quietly as they worked. "Might come in handy." Sarah smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened her features. "The trick isn't in the drawing," she replied. "It's in making them think you can't." At the telegraph office, operator Tommy Wilson's fingers flew across the key, sending news of the Carson gang's capture across the territory. But more importantly, he was spreading the story of how they'd been taken by a woman whose draw was faster than summer lightning. In a land where legends were born daily, this one had special resonance. Matt Carson, his bandaged hand throbbing despite Dr. Bennett's laudanum, sat in his cell, contemplating how quickly fortunes could change. "We should have listened to Luke," he muttered. "Boy knew something wasn't right about her." Luke, in the adjacent cell, had fallen into a contemplative silence. Unlike his cousins, he seemed almost relieved that their reign of terror had ended. "Reckon some legends just ain't meant to be challenged," he finally offered, like poking a sleeping mountain lion. Eleanor Turner had finally closed her pie stand and made her way to Sarah's side. Without a word, she pressed a fresh apple pie into the younger woman's hands. "For your supper," she said firmly. "My Thomas always said good shooting deserves good eating." Sarah accepted the pie with a graceful nod, though her eyes never stopped scanning her surroundings. 8 years of hunting dangerous men had taught her that trouble rarely came alone. "The Carsons have friends," she observed quietly to Sheriff Wade when he approached. "Some of them might take exception to today's events." Wade nodded, understanding the warning in her words. "Might be wise to stay in town a few days," he suggested, "at least until the telegraph brings word of how the wind's blowing in certain quarters." Dr. Bennett, finished with her patients, joined them in the street. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and clean. "You're welcome to stay with me," she offered. "My spare room has an excellent view of both the street and the stable yard." The doctor's practical consideration of defensive positions made Sarah smile again. As afternoon settled into evening, Willow Creek began to digest the day's events. The Carson gang's reign of terror was over, but something else had been born in its place. The legend of Lightning Hawkins would grow with each retelling, becoming a symbol of justice in a land where such things were rare and precious. But Sarah, watching the sunset from Dr. Bennett's spare room, knew that legends cast long shadows, and in those shadows other dangers were already stirring, drawn by the story of a proper lady with an improper talent for violence. News travels fast in the territories, carried on telegraph wires and whispered around campfires. By nightfall, the story of the Carson gang's defeat had reached the Copper Queen Saloon in Tombstone, where it found particularly interested ears. James "Blackjack" Morrison, leader of the notorious Morrison gang, sat at his regular table, listening to the breathless account from a newly arrived rider. "You expect me to believe," Blackjack drawled, his scarred face twisted in a skeptical smile, "that Jake Carson, who's killed 11 men in fair fights, got himself outdrawn by some fancy lady in a blue dress?" He took a long pull from his whiskey glass, dark eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Swear on my mother's grave," the rider insisted. "They're saying she moved faster than a rattler's strike, shot the gun clean out of Matt Carson's hand, took Jake's shooting arm out of commission, permanent-like." In Willow Creek, unaware of the attention her actions had drawn, Sarah Hawkins sat in Dr. Bennett's parlor, cleaning thunder with practiced precision. The Colt Lightning's mechanism required regular maintenance to achieve the speed she demanded from it. "3 telegrams came for you," Mary announced, entering with a small stack of papers. "1 from Marshal Davis in Prescott, 1 from Sheriff Taylor in Tucson, and 1 from someone named Catherine Stone in Boston." Sarah's hands stilled momentarily at the last name. "Katie was my roommate at finishing school," she explained softly. "She's the only one from my old life who knows what I became after that day on the trail to California." The doctor settled into her favorite chair, watching her friend's skilled hands return to their work. "The marshal and sheriff, I assume, want statements about the Carson gang and information about their connections," Sarah confirmed. "Jake and Matt Carson didn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone's been financing their operations, providing intelligence about payroll shipments, offering sanctuary when things got hot." Back in Tombstone, Blackjack Morrison was doing some calculating of his own. The Carson gang had been useful allies, helping maintain the delicate balance of power among the territory's outlaw factions. Their removal from the board changed things, created opportunities and threats. "Send word to Cooper and the Buchanan boys," he instructed one of his men. "Need to know if they've heard anything about this Lightning woman before today. Someone that fast doesn't just appear from nowhere." In the Willow Creek jail, Luke Carson had made a decision. "Sheriff," he called out, getting Wade's attention. "Reckon I might have some information worth trading." Wade approached the cell cautiously. Unlike his cousins, Luke had shown signs of genuine remorse since their capture. "What kind of information?" "About who's been backing our operations. Man name of Morrison. Blackjack Morrison." Luke's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He's got half the bankers and telegraph operators between here and Tombstone in his pocket. That's how we always knew about the payroll shipments." Sarah, who had accompanied Mary on her evening check of the prisoner's wounds, overheard the conversation. The name Morrison stirred old memories: a dusty trail, a family's wagon, gunshots in the growing dark. She'd been tracking those connections for 8 years, following the web of violence and corruption that had led to her family's murder. "Looks like you stirred up quite a hornet's nest," Dr. Bennett observed, noting the subtle tension in her friend's posture. "Blackjack Morrison isn't known for letting challenges to his authority go unanswered." "Good," Sarah replied, her refined accent doing nothing to mask the steel in her voice. "I've been looking for a way to draw him out. The Carsons were just one thread in his web, Time to start pulling it apart. As night settled over Willow Creek, more riders were moving through the darkness, carrying messages between scattered outlaw camps. The story of Lightning Hawkins was spreading, growing, with each telling. But behind the legend, deeper currents were stirring. In her room at the doctor's house, Sarah stood at the window, thunder close at hand. She watched the stars emerge above the mountains, thinking about the long trail that had led her here. The Carson gang's defeat wasn't an ending. It was merely the first move in a larger game, and somewhere out there, Blackjack Morrison was already planning his response. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with a crimson intensity that old-timers claimed foretold blood on the horizon. Sarah Hawkins, already awake and fully dressed, watched the sunrise from Dr. Bennett's porch while nursing a cup of coffee. 8 years of hunting had taught her to read the signs of approaching trouble, and every instinct told her this morning carried danger on its wings. "Rider coming," she murmured, catching the distant sound of hoofbeats before they were visible. Mary Bennett, joining her with her own coffee, marveled at her friend's acute senses. Within minutes, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, resolving into a hard-riding courier from the telegraph office. "Message for Miss Hawkins," the boy announced, holding out a telegram. "Mr. Wilson said it came marked urgent." Sarah accepted the paper, her expression unchanging as she read its contents. Only someone who knew her well would notice the subtle tightening around her eyes. "Katie's written from Boston," she explained to Mary. "Morrison's people have been asking questions about my family back east. They're trying to piece together who I am." She folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "They're also spreading word that the Carson gang killing was a setup, claiming I shot them from ambush. In Tombstone, Blackjack Morrison was already putting his next moves into play. Send these letters to our friends at the newspapers," he instructed his lieutenant, pushing forward a stack of carefully crafted correspondence. "Time to start shaping the story our way. What about Cooper's report?" the lieutenant asked, referring to the information they'd gathered overnight. "Seems this Lightning woman's been busy the past few years. 7 confirmed gunfights, all of them one clean, but always against men connected to our operations." Morrison's scarred face creased in thought. "She's been hunting us," he concluded, "working her way up the chain, probably hoping we'd notice eventually. Well, she's got our attention now." Back in Willow Creek, Sheriff Wade was dealing with his own complications. 3 more telegrams had arrived, these from other lawmen across the territory. "They all want to transport the Carsons themselves," he told Sarah when she stopped by his office. "Seems everybody's got a claim on them." "Morrison's influence," Sarah observed, examining the telegrams. "He's trying to get control of them before they can talk more about his operation." Her fingers traced the signatures. "I know this marshal in Prescott. He's honest. The other 2, she left the implication hanging. Luke Carson, overhearing from his cell, shifted uncomfortably. "Watch out for Marshal Hayes," he offered quietly. "He's been on Morrison's payroll for 3 years. Man's got a badge, but his soul belongs to Black Jack." Dr. Bennett, meanwhile, had received a visitor of her own. Catherine Stone's telegram had mentioned sending help, and it had arrived in the form of Elizabeth Lizzie Chen, a seemingly demure Chinese-American woman whose subtle moves spoke of extensive martial training. "Katie thought you could use another pair of eyes," Lizzie explained to Sarah, her refined San Francisco accent matching Sarah's Boston one, especially ones that most men won't take seriously. The 2 women sized each other up with professional appreciation, recognizing kindred spirits. Rebecca Mitchell, bringing supplies to the doctor's house, added her own intelligence. 3 strangers checked into the hotel last night," she reported. "Claimed to be cattle buyers, but Thomas at the stable says their horses show signs of hard riding, and they're carrying military-grade weapons." Sarah absorbed this information with calm precision. Morrison was moving faster than expected, but that could work to her advantage. He's used to dealing with men, she mused, with predictable responses and traditional challenges. He doesn't understand what he's facing. As morning stretched toward noon, more pieces moved on the invisible board. Morrison's men continued gathering information while positioning assets throughout the territory. Sarah and her growing circle of allies prepared for the coming storm in their own way. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the Arizona territory to its foundations. "You know," Lizzie commented, watching Sarah check Thunder's action for the third time that morning, "Katie always said you were the most dangerous person at that finishing school. Not because of how you handled a gun, but because of how you could think 3 moves ahead." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "In Boston, they taught us chess. Out here, I just changed the pieces." Her eyes swept the street, noting positions and angles. "And Morrison is about to learn that some queens can't be taken with ordinary moves." If you're enjoying this tale of the West's most remarkable gunslinger, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story about the Ghost Dance Uprising will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's return to Willow Creek, where the next moves in this deadly game were about to unfold. The 3 cattle buyers made their first move just after noon. 2 positioned themselves casually near the jail, while the third headed for Dr. Bennett's house. Their coordinated movements might have seemed natural to most observers, but Sarah Hawkins had spent years studying such choreographed violence. "Right on schedule," she murmured to Lizzie, who was pretending to read on the doctor's porch. "Morrison's men always get impatient around lunchtime." The 2 women had positioned themselves carefully, Sarah inside by the window, Lizzie outside providing a clear crossfire angle. The approaching man tipped his hat politely as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. "Afternoon, miss," he addressed Lizzie. "Might I speak with Miss Hawkins? Got a business proposition to discuss." "I'm afraid Miss Hawkins is indisposed," Lizzie replied, her San Francisco accent and demure manner perfect. "Perhaps you could leave a message." Her left hand remained hidden behind her book, inches from a derringer. "Message is simple." The man's polite facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Morrison sends his regards and suggests she release the Carson boys to proper authorities. Hate to see anything unfortunate happen to such a nice town." Sarah's voice drifted through the open window, maintaining its cultured Eastern tones. "Mr. Morrison should deliver his messages in person, Mr. Tucker. Yes, I know who you are. Richard Tucker, former cavalry sergeant, dishonorable discharge for selling ammunition to Apaches. Now you run errands for Black Jack." Tucker's hand dropped toward his gun, but stopped at the metallic click from the window. "Your reputation with a gun is impressive, ma'am," he said carefully. "But even you can't watch every direction at once. My friends by the jail are currently having an interesting conversation with Sheriff Wade and Deputy Wilson," Sarah interrupted, "along with Mrs. Turner and her very persuasive rolling pin." True to her words, the other 2 men found themselves caught in a carefully prepared trap. Eleanor Turner had positioned herself perfectly, her seemingly innocent pie stand giving her a clear angle on both men. The derringer hidden in her rolling pin was small, but at this range, it didn't need to be large. "Mighty fine day for pie, gentlemen," Eleanor called out cheerfully, "though I suspect you're not here for the apple or the cherry." Sheriff Wade and Deputy Wilson had emerged from the jail, their rifles covering the men with casual precision. Tucker, realizing his position, slowly raised his hands. "Just delivering a message," he repeated. "No need for things to get messy." "The message is received," Sarah replied. "Here's one for Mr. Morrison. The Carson gang chose their path. I simply became the consequence of that choice. If he continues down this road, he'll find similar consequences waiting." As Tucker backed away, Sarah noticed Dr. Bennett treating a patient through the window of her clinic, Luke Carson. The youngest of the gang had been sharing more information about Morrison's operations, details that painted a picture of corruption stretching from Arizona to Texas. "He's moving his pieces carefully," Lizzie observed, as Tucker and his companions rode out of town. "Testing defenses, probing for weaknesses." "Yes," Sarah agreed, finally stepping onto the porch. "But he's playing a game he doesn't fully understand." She adjusted her sunbonnet, thunder a reassuring presence beneath her skirts. "In Boston, they taught us that a lady should always appear properly attired and perfectly composed." "And the gun?" Lizzie asked with a small smile. "That's what makes the proper attire and perfect composure possible." Sarah's eyes tracked the departing riders. "Morrison will try again, but now he knows we're ready. His next move will be bolder." The sun climbed toward afternoon, casting shorter shadows across Willow Creek's streets. In those shadows, plans were being made, alliances formed, and strategies developed. The game was entering its next phase, and the stakes were rising with each move. Blackjack Morrison's reaction to Tucker's report was characteristically controlled. He sat in his private room above the Copper Queen's saloon, slowly rotating a glass of Kentucky bourbon, while his lieutenant delivered the news of their failed intimidation attempt. "So," he said finally, his scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight, "the ladies got the town organized." "Interesting." He stood, moving to study a map of the territory pinned to his wall. "Send word to Hayes. Tell him to make his move tomorrow morning. Let's see how she handles official interference." Back in Willow Creek, Sarah sat at Dr. Bennett's kitchen table, with Lizzie and Mary reviewing their own intelligence. 3 riders left town heading south, Lizzie reported, but 6 came in from the east. They're gathering strength. "They'll try to use Hayes first," Sarah predicted, cleaning thunder with practiced precision. "The marshal's badge gives him legitimate authority to demand custody of the Carsons. It's a smart play, forces us to either comply or become outlaws ourselves." Dr. Bennett frowned, pouring more coffee. "Luke's been sharing more about Hayes's connection to Morrison. Apparently, the marshal's been helping fake deaths for wanted men, letting them start fresh under new names. For a price, of course." "Convenient. Way to make witnesses disappear," Sarah observed. Her hands never stopped their methodical work on her weapon. "It's also how Morrison's been building his network. Men who owe him their new lives make loyal soldiers." A knock at the back door brought Rebecca Mitchell with fresh intelligence. "Telegraph operator caught someone trying to send an encoded message to Tombstone," she reported. "Young Billy Cooper managed to copy it down before they noticed him." Sarah studied the coded message, her finishing school education proving unexpectedly useful. "It's a simple book cipher," she explained. "Standard practice in Boston social circles, believe it or not. Ladies using them to arrange tea parties gave me plenty of practice." The decoded message confirmed their suspicions. Marshal Hayes would arrive the next morning with papers demanding the Carsons' transfer. He would be accompanied by deputies, Morrison's men wearing badges. "They're not just coming for the Carsons," Lizzie noted, reading between the lines. "They want to discredit. You turn the law against you. A woman operating outside proper channels makes an easy target." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "They're thinking like men, expecting me to react like one. Direct confrontation, challenge to authority." She shook her head. 8 years ago, that might have worked, but Boston taught me there are more elegant solutions. Sheriff Wade arrived as they were finishing their planning. "Got word from my friend in Prescott," he reported. "The real transfer papers for the Carsons are still being processed. Anything Hayes brings will be forged." "Perfect," Sarah replied, her refined accent containing a note of satisfaction. "That gives us what we need. Now, about those new arrivals. In town, while they plotted, Morrison's men continued filtering into Willow Creek in small groups, taking rooms at different establishments, careful not to attract attention. But the town had changed since the Carson gang's capture. Eyes watched from windows, information flowed through carefully established channels, and preparations were made in quiet corners. Eleanor Turner organized the town's ladies into her pie. And Information Society, their seemingly innocent gatherings masking a sophisticated intelligence network. Deputy Wilson coordinated with local ranchers to monitor the outlying approaches to town. Dr. Bennett prepared her clinic for possible casualties, while maintaining her role as a source of inside information from treating Luke Carson. As night fell over Willow Creek, Sarah stood at her window watching the stars emerge. "Katie always said I took the finishing school lessons too seriously," she mused to Lizzie, "especially the parts about proper planning and social warfare." "From what I'm seeing," Lizzie replied, "you learned them just right." She paused, considering. "You know tomorrow's going to be complicated." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly, thunder ready at her side. "But complicated is what ladies do best." The piece was set, the trap prepared. Now they just had to wait for Marshal Hayes to spring it. Marshal William Hayes arrived in Willow Creek at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, riding at the head of a column of 6 deputies. His appearance was carefully calculated. Polished badge, well-maintained uniform, every inch the respectable. Lawman, only someone with Sarah's experience might notice how his deputies' guns rode low in their holsters, or how their eyes scanned the town with predatory intensity. "Quite the reception committee," Hayes commented, reining in before the jail. Sheriff Wade stood on the porch, Deputy Wilson at his side. Sarah Hawkins sat demurely in a rocking chair, appearing to work on embroidery, while Dr. Bennett stood nearby. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Marshal," Wade called out. "Bit of a surprise visit, isn't it?" His tone was friendly, but his hand rested. Near his gun, Hayes dismounted smoothly, producing an official-looking document from his coat. "Nothing unexpected, Sheriff. Just here to transport the Carson gang to territorial custody. Got all the papers right here." "Of course," Sarah spoke up, her voice carrying the perfect note of feminine concern. "Though I'm puzzled by something, Marshal. The territorial court in Prescott confirmed an hour ago by telegraph that the transfer papers are still being processed. Won't be ready until next week." A flicker of unease crossed Hayes's face, quickly masked. "Must be some confusion. Ma'am, these papers came directly from Judge Morrison's office." He stopped, realizing his mistake too late. "Judge Morrison?" Sarah's needle flashed in the sunlight as she continued her embroidery. "How interesting. I wasn't aware that Blackjack's father was still serving on the bench, especially since he passed away 3 years ago." The deputies' hands moved closer to their weapons as Hayes's facade cracked slightly. "Now, see here," he began, but Sarah continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I'm also curious about these deputies," she mused, "especially Mr. Tucker there on the bay horse. Wasn't he just here yesterday delivering messages for Mr. Morrison? My, how quickly one can change careers in the territories." The tension in the street ratcheted higher as Hayes realized his careful plan was unraveling. "The Carsons are wanted men," he tried, switching tactics. "They need to face proper justice." "Oh, I couldn't agree more," Sarah replied, finally setting aside her embroidery to face him directly. "In fact, I took the liberty of sending copies of Luke Carson's sworn testimony about your arrangement with Blackjack Morrison to 3 different territorial judges, the real ones, that is." Movement caught Hayes's attention, townspeople appearing on rooftops, in windows and doorways. Eleanor Turner calmly served pies to armed men positioned behind her stand. Rebecca Mitchell's store. Windows concealed several ranchers with rifles. "You see, Marshal," Sarah continued, her Boston accent precise and proper, "while you were preparing this little performance, we were having a lovely series of tea parties. Amazing what ladies can accomplish over coffee and pie." "You're bluffing," Hayes growled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Sarah smiled gently. "Tell me, Marshal, did you really think Morrison's plan to use official authority against me would work?" I spent years in Boston society, dealing with men who hide behind respectability as something of a specialty. Thunder still rested beneath her skirts, but Sarah hadn't moved from her rocking chair. She didn't need to. Hayes looked around, finally understanding that his force was hopelessly outnumbered by determined townspeople. "Now," Sarah said softly, "I suggest you and your deputies ride out of Willow Creek. When you see Mr. Morrison, tell him that using proxies won't work. If he wants to test me, he'll have to do it himself." Hayes hesitated, calculating odds and options, but with evidence of his corruption already en route to legitimate authorities, and his men surrounded by armed citizens, there was really only one choice. "This isn't over," he warned as he mounted up. "No," Sarah agreed pleasantly, returning to her embroidery, "but the next move belongs to Blackjack. Do give him my regards." As Hayes and his men rode out of town, Dr. Bennett approached Sarah's chair. "You realize Morrison will have to come himself now," she said quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied, her needle moving with deadly precision. That was rather the point. In Tombstone's Copper Queen saloon, Blackjack Morrison's reaction to Hayes's failure sent glasses shattering against the wall. The marshal's report had confirmed his worst fears. This woman wasn't just dangerous with a gun, she was dismantling his carefully built network piece by piece. "She's got copies of Luke's testimony?" he demanded, his scarred face twisted with rage. "And the town's actually standing with her?" "Every last one of them," Hayes confirmed, still dusty from his ride. "The women are organized into some kind of information network. The men are armed and positioned. It's like she turned the whole town into a fortress without anyone noticing." Morrison paced his private room, mind working through possibilities. 8 years of building his operation, placing corrupt officials, establishing control over the territories, all threatened by one woman with a quick draw and finishing school manners. "Get word to every camp," he ordered his lieutenant. "I want every gun we can trust in Willow Creek by tomorrow night. If she wants to face me directly, I'll give her what she wants, along with 40 armed men." Back in Willow Creek, Sarah sat with her growing circle of allies in Dr. Bennett's parlor. Lizzie had just returned from scouting the outlying areas, bringing news of increased rider activity. "They're gathering," she reported. "Small groups moving under cover of darkness. Morrison's calling in everyone who owes him favors." "Good," Sarah replied, surprising some with her response. "Better to face them all at once than keep dealing with proxies." She turned to Sheriff Wade. "How many men can we count on?" 20 reliable townsmen," he answered. "Another 15 from nearby ranches. They're all good shots, but they're not gunfighters." "They don't need to be," Sarah assured him. "Determination and righteous cause count for more than fast draws. In this kind of fight," her fingers traced Thunder's grip beneath her skirts, "Morrison's men fight for money, ours fight for home." Rebecca Mitchell arrived with fresh intelligence from her store. 3 more of Morrison's men came in for supplies. They were careful, but I overheard enough. Black Jack himself is riding out of Tombstone tonight. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "He'll want to arrive at dawn. It's what I'd do, use the rising sun to blind defenders on the west side of town." She turned to Eleanor Turner. "How are our preparations?" The widow smiled grimly. "Every lady in town's been baking all day. The men think we're preparing for a celebration. Really, we're positioning ammunition and supplies throughout town. Amazing what you can hide in pie baskets," Dr. Bennett added her own report. "Luke's agreed to testify against Morrison in open court. Seems watching Hayes run helped him find his courage. He's written out everything he knows, names, dates, operations. Even if tomorrow goes badly, Morrison's days of operating in shadows are over." "It won't go badly," Sarah said softly, her Boston accent somehow making the words more certain. "Morrison's using an old playbook. Overwhelming force, shock and awe, public display of power. He's expecting us to respond like men would." "But we're not men," Lizzie finished with a knowing smile. "We're proper ladies." "Exactly." Sarah stood, moving to the window to watch the sunset paint the sky crimson. "In Boston, they taught us that true power isn't in brute force. It's in controlling the situation before the first move is made." The ladies of Willow Creek continued their preparations under the guise of social calls and baking parties. Men gleaned their rifles while pretending to repair farm equipment. Deputy Wilson coordinated signals and positions using children's games as cover. As night fell, Sarah penned a quick note to her friend Katie in Boston. "Dear Catherine," she wrote, "tomorrow will likely decide matters one way or another. If I don't survive, please know that your friendship helped me remain a lady while becoming what circumstances required. And if I do survive, I suspect Blackjack Morrison is about to learn why Boston finishing schools were more dangerous than he could imagine." The stage was set. Come dawn, Willow Creek would either fall to Morrison's army of outlaws or become the site of his operation's destruction. Sarah Hawkins intended to ensure the latter. Dawn broke over Willow Creek exactly as Sarah had predicted, the rising sun casting long shadows across the silent streets. Blackjack Morrison sat astride his horse at the head of 40 armed riders, studying the seemingly deserted town through narrowed eyes. "Mighty quiet," he commented to Hayes, who rode beside him. "Almost like they're expecting us." "Oh, we were." Sarah's voice carried clearly from the center of the street. She stood alone, her blue dress immaculate, sunbonnet shading her eyes from the rising sun. "Though I must say, 40 men seems a touch excessive just to deal with one lady." Morrison's scarred face twisted in a cold smile. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Miss Hawkins. Figured it was time we met properly." His eyes scanned the buildings, noting the subtle signs of prepared positions. "Going to be a lot of dead townspeople if this goes badly." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied, her Boston accent precise and proper. "You see, while you were gathering gunmen, we were having a lovely series of social events. Tea parties, baking circles, sewing bees. Would you like to know what proper ladies discuss at such gatherings?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly as movement caught his eye. Eleanor Turner calmly stepped onto her porch, a pie basket in hand. She reached in and, instead of pastry, produced a loaded shotgun. All across town, ladies in their Sunday best emerged from doorways and windows, revealing an arsenal of weapons. "We discussed things like firing positions," Sarah continued pleasantly, "ammunition distribution, signal coordination. You'd be amazed how much tactical planning can be accomplished over tea and cookies." More movement revealed armed townsmen in prepared positions covering every approach. Morrison's forces found themselves caught in a carefully prepared crossfire, with Sarah standing calmly at its center. "Your men are brave when bullying farmers or robbing banks," Sarah observed. "But are they ready to die for you? Because every person aiming a weapon at them right now is defending their home." Morrison's face darkened with rage. "You think you can outshoot all of us?" His hand moved toward his gun. "No," Sarah replied simply. "I only need to outshoot you." Thunder cleared its holster before Morrison's fingers touched his grip. The shot took him precisely where she'd aimed, the gun arm, just as she'd done with Jake Carson. What followed was a testament to Sarah's prediction. Facing determined townspeople fighting for their homes, Morrison's men quickly lost heart. Some fled immediately, others surrendered when their leader fell. Hayes tried to rally them, but Lizzie's perfectly aimed shot knocked his badge off his chest along with his courage. Within minutes it was over. Morrison sat in the dust, his shattered arm cradled against his chest, staring up at the woman who dismantled his empire with perfect manners and precise violence. "You know what truly offends me about men like you?" Sarah asked conversationally. Thunder still trained steadily. "It's not the violence or the corruption, it's the lack of elegance. In Boston, we learned that true power lies in controlling the situation before it begins. You never stood a chance because you were still playing checkers while I was playing chess. As the townspeople secured the prisoners, Dr. Bennett approached to tend Morrison's wound. "You should be grateful," she told him as she worked. She'd been truly angry, that shot would have been 6 inches higher. Sarah holstered Thunder beneath her skirts and adjusted her sunbonnet. "Sheriff," she called to Wade, "I believe the territorial marshal will want to speak with Mr. Morrison about various matters, particularly once he receives Luke Carson's sworn testimony." The sun climbed higher over Willow Creek as order was restored. The legend of Lightning Hawkins grew once again, but not just as a deadly gunfighter. She became known as something far more dangerous, a proper lady who'd turned social graces into weapons and afternoon tea into tactical planning. "What now?" Lizzie asked, as they watched Morrison and his men being led away. Sarah smiled, checking her timepiece. "Now? I believe it's time for tea. After all, a lady never lets violence disrupt proper social schedules."